Hey team, welcome to episode 105 of Transition Talk, where we talk about dental transitions and how to navigate the sometimes messy path to practice ownership. Getting to a point where you feel ready to sell yourself or bring on a partner is a big step in itself. But is your practice ready for a transition? What should you be looking for to be absolutely certain? We'll dive into these questions in this episode. And joining me today is NDP Senior Transition Consultant, Morgan Ramsey. She is a CPA and a member of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. She has extensive experience in tax and accounting and financial planning. We found her through CWA. She was an associate planner there, and she's been helping guide our NDP clients through the transition process since 2020. Morgan, I am so happy for your debut episode of Transition Talk.
Thank you, Christy. I'm very excited to be here.
A little bit for those of you who have worked with Morgan or will work with Morgan. At one point in time pre-COVID, we all were one big happy family here in the office, and then COVID happened. And much like the rest of the world, we scattered, and Morgan went back to her home state of Alabama and lives there with her very cute dog, Wilma. Was Wilma missing you since you're in person here today?
Is. I've been doing FaceTimes with her at night.
Okay, so I'm very excited to talk to you about this topic. It's a common question that I know Charles and I get when we're having more kind of coaching calls, but the practice environment, I think, has changed since COVID. It's changed with the interest rate environment and just the economy changing. Buyers are being more diligent, and I kind of use the word picky in quotes, but more picky. Cash is more expensive to get. Lenders are looking more closely. And so I think that, the cream rises to the top is true here in the practice transition world as well. And I think healthy practices are easier to transition. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is kind of what makes that practice healthy. You work with our clients day in and day out. If I just say, the basic question of what does it require for a practice to be healthy, where would you start?
I think I would start based from a seller's perspective, just the type of transition you're looking for, whether you're looking to sell for 100% and retirement wise, and then if you're looking to sell and bring on a partner. So retirement wise, I think in selling 100%, it kind of comes into the fact of the value is obviously important, but we have to look at cash flows and profitability of the practice so that we can figure out that value that works out for you retirement wise. And then also there's the point of when, if you want to work back in the practice after, and what that will look like for you. I think about for bringing on a partner, you just have to make sure that your practice is at the point where it will support a 2-doctor for production wise.
Mm-hmm. We've had previous episodes, and if you've ever heard Charles speak, we have a lot of slides that say, hey, this is the size of practice that makes sense for a partnership. I know we've certainly worked with practices that are smaller in scale and still have a partnership. The cash just gets smaller, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to have enough. You have to understand that you have one pie of money, and now we've got to split it into two, and does that work for both of you, right? And if I'm the more senior doc, maybe I don't need as much because I have all my debt paid off and I don't have young kids. I may think that that's enough for me, but if I then am bringing on a young person who has debt, who has young kids, who has student loans, who has to purchase the practice, maybe that his pie of the money isn't enough. Kind of thinking about that is important. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, and the size of the practice, because we obviously work with multiple facets of sizes of practices, from smaller to larger. It's just finding the right buyer and the financial needs of both of y'all to factor into that to figure out which transition or transaction is appropriate for you.
And on episode 104, we were talking with Matt, and we brought up this as well, right? If I know that I have to work back for a period of time as a seller and my financial plan requires I do that, well, then the type of sale that I'm looking at and the timing of when I look for that might change, right? So it doesn't mean your practice isn't healthy, right? That's what we're talking about today. It's my practice can be healthy, but is it healthy in relationship to what it needs to be in order to support me, buyer, partner, whatever it might be? So as you listen to today, what is healthy for your individual practice is going to differ. I think a lot of the things we're going to talk about today are universal, but transitions are not a one-size-fit-all thing. So if you're thinking about a transition, you're wondering if your practice is healthy enough, clearly you know how to find us. But as you listen the rest of today, just kind of know that we're going to be coming from the place of really this could be applied to either 100% sale or partnership. So what else? What's the number one thing?
Well, number one thing, not only for everyone, the seller, the buyer and then also the lender who's going to be ultimately lending to the buyer is the cash flow and the profitability of the practice. And what plays a big part into that is also the overhead of the practice. Obviously, we look at that and see, we like that to be more of like the 55 to 60 range, but that also depends on the profitability of the practice and the size, because obviously something that is producing around like 500,000 and has 50% overhead, which is great overhead, but that's kind of cash flowing around 250. And so if you're bringing in a partner in that, you have to think about if that works for both of y'all financially. And then obviously a larger practice production wise, if their overhead is higher on the 70%, they have more room for the cash flows for their overhead to be higher. So it's just kind of where your practice stands size wise and the overhead. And obviously Kane Waters has a great, like, how does your practice compare, which is a great resource to look at to see percentage wise where your expenses should fall in line, whether you're a 1 doctor, 2 doctor, and the specific type of practice that you are.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note here when we talk about cash flow and overhead, right? Like if we think that how your practice compare book is broken down, based on number of locations and specialties, et cetera. But I think it's also important to note that like a 50% overhead in a practice would be great, right? Like I think we all would be very happy with that. But 50% of a $500,000 practice is a different cash flow stream than a 50% of $1 million practice, right? And so a buyer, right? And I think this goes to what you were saying earlier, which is if I'm looking for 100% sale, right? I have to find a buyer whose life can live off of the 250 that exists after that 500,000 with the 50% overhead. And it's literally not a judgment on the practice or the size. It's a strong, healthy practice with a 50% overhead, but the buyer may not be the buyer for you if 250 is not enough to support their lifestyle, their mortgage, their kids, their student loans, the practice note, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and we also look at like if they're a current associate, what they're making now, and like if they're making 400,000 as an associate, and we're asking them to cut back to 250,000. Now they have this debt service. You just have to think about that on their side of how that's going to affect them financially.
Yeah. And I think too, like a large practice, million plus that has a maybe higher than average overhead, like let's say 65 plus, maybe it's still not a healthy overhead or maybe a higher overhead, but cash flow wise, that could still work for a buyer,
yeah,
right?
There's more like wiggle room.
Yeah. More wiggle room and more opportunity too, probably for some like streamlining of the overhead, which is always helpful. So I think that if I'm you listening to this podcast, if you're a seller who's thinking like, hey, here's what I want to do, I think figuring out, like you said earlier, like what's your plan, but then also making sure you're looking at your overhead, you're looking at those expenses, you're comparing it to the benchmark that Kane Waters has, or you're looking at another benchmark, whatever you're doing, making sure you understand like, what is my direct cost? What are my fixed costs? How can I eke out as much as I can to bring my overhead in line so that that is one of the factors that if I'm in a competitive area and there are going to be multiple buyers or, multiple people selling their practice, like I want mine to kind of shine the most and I want there to be the least amount of questions so I can maximize the value. Because I think that's the thing that was probably easier to do pre-COVID for sure. But even in, post-COVID in those like lower interest rate times, debt service wasn't very expensive, right? Like we did our models, like we used to put, what was the lowest you remember putting in?
I think one person I got, they had like a 2.75 interest rate.
Isn't that crazy?
And now it's like gone, we're like estimating like a 7%.
Yeah. And so, that can be the difference between cash flows working for someone of a smaller practice and smaller cash flow practice and it not working, right? And so like just simply the environment that we're in can change the cash flows to the buyer, which then make it work or not work, right?
Yeah.
Your practice can still be healthy, but the cash flows themselves have to work. So
yeah, it's definitely a good mixture between the healthiness of your practice, but then also finding the right buyer for you.
100%. I know there's some kind of one-off things that are important. What are some other things you think about when you think about a healthy practice?
So probably like the staff and your processes. Obviously, it looks better if you have a more tenured staff and that are loyal to the practice, know the processes, kind of like good processes in place rather than a lot of turnover. And it's just kind of been different people each year. So not everyone's like familiar with it, which that's a really good thing. And then it's also like coming in and working with them makes that for a buyer much easier because they can kind of help them out and know how the practice runs.
What would you say to someone who says like, oh, but it's a very tenured staff and so like maybe they'll all leave?
Yeah, I get that a lot with buyers. That's their fear because they just feel like they are going to be so loyal to that doctor that they're scared that once the change happens, they're going to freak out and leave. But I think in those situations, it's just kind of like a delicate line of like the doctor announcing his retirement or like easing you into the practice, the buyer. And then also kind of just for the buyer, like keeping the practice as much as is as possible. Like not coming in and changing a bunch of things, like getting rid of health insurance that they're providing. But I think it's just kind of staying the course as the practice is kind of helping like ease the anxiousness of the tenured employees.
And I think, I mean, look, you'll have someone who it's office manager, they've been there for 20 years and they're ready to retire too. And I think what we try to do is get sellers to make sure that that person is willing to commit to stay around for a certain amount of time, right? So, I mean, it's going to happen. And honestly, in this environment, you're going to be an owner, you're going to have to deal with staff turnover because that's a thing more than it used to be. But I do think I agree with you that the process is a healthy, someone who collects their money, who has a good treatment coordinator, like those are going to be more turnkey practices that are easier for a buyer to see, oh, like they have their stuff together. Like this is something I can step into and will work as long as like the seller supports me and transitions me in the right way.
And to touch on the point about like them staying on if they are being, because I've had some clients that it was maybe their wife and obviously they're not going to stay on once their husband retires, or it's even like someone's been there for so long and they just planned when he retired that they're going to retire. And in those cases, what we usually do is probably just have an agreement that they will work back for a couple of weeks or so just to train the new office manager to ensure that the new office manager is able to step into that role and understand what the duties are.
Yeah, 100%. So staff, process, what else?
Mainly like new patient flow, and like if you have a strong recall system, especially for like ortho, retention is a big thing. So making sure that those processes are in line and that you have like the new patients that's coming in or following up and coming back afterwards. And then also for a partnership to touch on is like space wise, if you are planning to bring in a partner, just making sure that the space or the office is equipped to have a second doctor in there and to work two doctors and so that you're not having to switch days or something like that and maybe reduce days, but just making sure there's enough for
physical space for you both to kind of accommodate. Yeah. And I think back on that new patient piece, there'll be times where you don't need new patients, right? Like especially established doctors selling 100%, you know, they're not marketing, they're comfortable with where they are. And some buyers will come to us and say, this is a red flag. Like this practice, they don't have enough new patients. And my first question is always like, how much are they spending on advertising? And like, do they actually want new patients? Are they accepting new patients? If someone's marketing and they're accepting new patients and new patients are low, well, like I'll agree with you there. But for the most part, I think a lot of doctors are just comfortable with where they are and they don't need them.
Yeah.
What do you do, kind of a little off topic, but I think because we're saying new patients is like a healthy, quote, quote, healthy like stat, what would you tell someone whose new patients were low? Like what can they do to kind of verify that the area can accommodate that, or kind of what do you tell them to do as part of their diligence?
So in our analysis, what I was going to add on to that is typically with buyers, we oftentimes more tenured sellers, they do slow down on their advertising. So we just kind of like accommodate into our analysis like a larger advertising expense to kind of, because we assume as going into a new buyer, you're going to need more advertising to get yourself started and get more patients. But another thing is that we also have our sellers typically send out like a patient notification letter, and it's to the patients and then also like referral sources, so that it's kind of giving their blessing of the buyer so that they know going forward who the buyer is and that he's well renowned, and to the patients will hopefully stick around and then also keep referring to them or her.
And then I think too, like demographics of the space, like if you aren't sure, like if you're not from the area, being able to do a demographic report to make sure that like if you're a pediatric dentist, are there a lot of schools in the area? You know, like there's a lot of groundwork that I think buyers should do, that if I'm a seller and I know I don't have a lot of new patients, a great option is for them to go ahead and pull that together themselves so they can say, hey buyer, I know that I don't have a lot of new patients, I don't need them, but here's 4 schools that just started in the area, here's the new housing. Like as a seller, I think you can kind of counteract some of the things about your practice that might not seem healthy but that are choices, but you are educated enough to know, hey, a buyer's going to look at this, here's the information about this that we'll know. Or I don't like sponsoring little league games, but they ask me all the time, and if I wanted to, I know that would pull in new families, but I don't need them, so here you go. You know, like those types of information from sellers, I think are always very helpful.
Yeah. Patient demographic reports are very important as well if you are looking for that. And we also like have a resource that we kind of can refer people to if they want to do one of those.
Absolutely. You mentioned when we were talking earlier, like consistency, right?
Yes.
How does that play into this?
This is a big thing because typically looking at this, we look at the past 3 years, and lending banks do too. So it's not just us looking at it. It's based on how lending will perceive your practice and the profitability. And consistency is a big thing. As long as you're staying the course and kind of not cutting back on your production or cutting back on numbers of days prior to you wanting to sell, that makes it better and a better opportunity for the buyer, and then also lending looking at it. So just making sure that your practice is at its healthiest towards the end so that it's more profitable, not only for the value that you end up selling it for, but then also for the buyer coming in and lending potential for them.
Yeah, like exit on a high note.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's sad, but you do see sellers who come to us who have been thinking about this for a while and have hesitated to pull the trigger, and they've just kind of started slowly going down. And it's been a conscious choice for most of them, right? Like, I'm going to scale back. I just want more time. But they do that thinking that like, oh, well, the potential of this practice is what it was 5 years ago. And like, unfortunately, just no one really cares about potential.
Yeah, and that's a big thing with lending. They don't really lend on the potential of money, but they look at the hard facts. So if you're sitting there saying this has such potential for growth, but they'd like to see that.
Yeah. And I think a big question, if you're listening to this and maybe your overhead's higher and maybe you don't have as many new patients and you have been scaling back. And so like, you're kind of listening to this thinking like, oh no, oh no, oh no. The question would be, can my practice still sell if it's not considered what you guys are explaining is healthy? And like, should they be worried? Like, what would you tell these people?
I don't think they should necessarily be worried. These are obviously like the highest factors that we put into it. And like, we see everything. I've seen a lot of practices where the seller has cut back a day or two. And so they've gone down, and it's not like the buyer can't get lending because of that. But we just like to optimize as much value and profitability for you. So that's why we say this, but I wouldn't necessarily worry about like your practice not being healthy enough for us to be able to find a buyer.
There's a buyer for most, won't say all, but almost all practices. I think it's expectations too.
Yeah.
It's like knowing like, hey, like if I do cut back, I'm not going to be able to ask if my practice does $1 million and then I scale back, now it's doing 750. Like it's going to be judged based on being a 750 practice, not $1 million practice. So I think it's just also setting expectations and understanding that and like educating yourself on what it means so that as you get this feedback from buyers, your feelings don't get hurt. You're not thinking buyers are being too picky. Like understanding that this is the environment we're in and like healthy, it kind of has a meaning to us, but like healthy can mean something different from you. And like you said, having a healthy practice, but then also finding a buyer that appreciates that healthy is important. Well, I think this has been really good. I think this will be very helpful. Thank you so much for being our guest and for joining us in Texas. It's always so fun and sharing your knowledge and experience with the listeners. That's all we have for today, guys. Thanks for joining us for episode 105 of Transition Talk. And as always, make sure to share the transition love with those who may not know of us yet. And of course, subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, friends.